Hello, my friend. Welcome and great joy and happiness to you in your day. Today, I'd like to talk about a topic that many meditators or most people engaged in meditative practice are blessed with sooner or later to some degree, the bliss and benefits of Samādhi. Samādhi is a Pali word, also a Sanskrit word, that is often translated as concentration. And this translation is etymologically quite apt, since the word Samādhi in these ancient Indic languages has the connotation of gathering things together, lumping things together. So concentrating things in one place. But since the word concentration in English often has connotations of a kind of like a brow furrowing, strongly efforting activity, an activity, kind of something that the mind or the self controlling the mind or apparently in charge of the mind, an activity that the self does with some constant pressure. So it's something that you do actively. And this connotation, this approach to Samadhi can easily lead to over-efforting, basically. In Samadhi practice, there's like both efforting too little or being too laissez-faire, too kind of, allowing, too relaxed, can be a hindrance, but so can efforting too much. And this is reflected in already in the Pali Canon, in the early suttas, where the Buddha kind of provides the simile of stringing a lute. If one strings a lute too loose, the strings don't sound, obviously. But if you string them too tight, the sound is strained and they might snap. And this snapping in over-efforting, this kind of brow furrowing, like really constant hard effort on keeping the mind on an object like the breath, which is like perhaps the paradigmatic example of Samadhi practice in the Buddhist tradition, Anapanasati breath meditation. What the snapping kind of usually means is ramping frustration with the fact that despite all efforts, despite all the strenuous efforts, the mind still strays into distraction. It still is not kept in place fully and completely, and that results in a kind of push and pull in the mind. Push and pull being basically one of the foundations in dynamic, or one of the ways we could model one of the fundamental dynamics of suffering is push and pull, that the mind gets into a kind of tangle with itself, or with its interpretations, with its views, with its activities, with its goals and purposes, clinging on to results, particular results, and really kind of, getting into a kind of conflict with itself. And that's not helpful for what Samadhi actually is supposed to be like, and not what it's supposed to lead to. Samadhi, the purpose of Samadhi in some sense, concentration is very, by itself, Samadhi is very useful. In the gradual training in the Buddhist canon, one first cultivates concentration, or kind of, or like actually first cultivates, in the very classical terms, one cultivates virtue or morality, shila, or sila, depending on the language. And then cultivate Samadhi, and then with that Samadhi one cultivates wisdom or understanding or insight. With the concentrated mind, basically we could here think of the Tibetan Buddhist or the Mahayana figure of the Bodhisattva of wisdom, of discriminating wisdom, Manjushri, who wields the sword as kind of blazing sword of discriminating wisdom. It's sharpening the sword of Manjushri, so that your mind can kind of cut through phenomena with more skill and ease, and one can look penetratingly into the nature of things. It's very difficult to do insight practice properly if the mind is scattered. Like it really requires a kind of deepened, a deepening viewing of something, of some kind of dynamic in one's experience, impermanence, no self, unsatisfactoriness or emptiness or whatever. Or even with engaging with one's kind of psychological content, which is also a valuable form of insight work. they all require kind of, the mind to be relatively non-scattered. So concentration, samadhi, has this great benefit. But samadhi is also aimed directly at something that is actually also holds lots of insight to it, which is samatha, or shamatha. Samatha in Pali, shamatha in Sanskrit, which is tranquility or well-being. Samadhi, and that's the bliss of samadhi. Samadhi kind of, as the mind grows more still and quiet, and as it kind of settles with an object, and the simple contentment with resting with a simple object, this provokes a kind of sense of yes, contentment and ease and well-being. The stillness of it is by its very nature quite blissful. It's free. It's free of the hindrances, the 5 hindrances, which I'll return to in a moment. And it's free of stress, it's free of papancha, it's free of proliferation of thought. The discursive mind quietens down to some degree, perhaps, though this is not a linear thing. The stilling of the discursive mind is actually something that kind of more takes place over time in practice through insight. And that insight comes from the very kind of experience of samadhi and samatha. The mind, as it grows more familiar with states of samadhi and states of samatha, the mind kind of understands, it grows more familiar also with the experience that this stillness and this kind of relative, this non-grasping and this kind of, this ease and simplicity is blissful. It's nice. And all the so-called sub-minds, all the parts of the mind involved in the kind of, or the various sub-minds or parts of the mind with their various agendas and so on, grow to understand more and more themselves that this simplicity is in fact indeed something to be cultivated, and something pleasant and something nice. And that is insight. That's a form of insight, an insight that is kind of bred from mere, basically just familiarity with samadhi and samatha. And that, over time tends to cause also like a stilling of the discursive mind, as insight into the kind of the utility and ease and joy of these states kind of increases. So those are kind of, here we could say already the two kind of, great benefits of samadhi is one is that it sharpens the mind for any kind of insight activity or just life in general. I mean, like just the ability to concentrate better and, and also the stilling of the discursive mind through insight and so on makes, focusing on basically anything much more effective. It might be focusing on the beauty of nature. It might be focusing on the warmth of the sun on your skin, or it might be focusing on reading a book, reading an article, reading or writing something, or studying, etc. Focusing on your work, whatever form it takes. So that sharpening is one of the great benefits, and the other benefit is the bliss, is the samatha that comes through it. And these, as we can here say already, these intermingle, so that the sharpening of the mind and the stilling of the mind provokes samatha, provokes, like, it evokes well-being and simplicity and stillness and so on. And these give insight to the mind that then kind of, cultivates future well-being and stillness and so on, which can then be used for further insight practice and so on, which then also tie into samadhi, make samadhi more accessible and make it more present, ever present in one's life and experience and so on. But yes, back to the word concentration. Another kind of, translation for samadhi that's often used is indistractability, because again, concentration can have these connotations of something very active. And actually samadhi, when it becomes when it deepens, it's much more akin to a flow state. It's much more, it becomes, as one progresses in practice more and more, again, too much effort is a problem, too little effort can also be a problem, and depending where one is at in one's practice and the level of insight one has to that kind of, the bliss and benefits of that samadhi, which is basically is tantamount to how big of a part of one's mind, in some sense, finds it useful and skillful to enter into those states and be undistracted. the further one progresses, the less effort one, generally speaking, needs to kind of to apply. And in this sense, deep samadhi is much more akin to it's much more a passive endeavor in some sense. It's like putting your attention on an object and not really doing anything. It's more akin to non-interference ultimately. So indistractability is also used often as a translation. So it's not so much of an action like concentration or something that requires active effort ultimately. As you're beginning, you do need to apply effort, and it can also be a great hindrance to practice if you just always just sit and don't do anything, or have no kind of goals, or no kind of no application of the mind. Sometimes the mind needs to cultivate samadhi and get the initial familiarity with it to kind of create that insight that then kind of supplies for less efforting ways of concentrating, or less effortful ways of achieving samadhi in the future. To get that initial familiarity with it and the insight that creates, one needs to kind of exercise some tyranny in the mind. Like efforting basically in dynamic terms, I would think is best understood as some part of the mind, or maybe perhaps a majority of the mind, that finds that has kind of is invested in that practice of samadhi or that practice of meditation, that they kind of they simply overrule any other opinions or any other kind of agendas and so on. They kind of enforce their will on the mind. And this is not something that should be done forever, or at least in all cases. Very often it's good to kind of be open and listen to all the other agendas in the mind, be kind of very open and allowing of them, and to kind of let go into whatever kind of arises in that sense. But one does need to apply effort, in one's practice, and that it never really, or like it takes a long time. It does reach that stage. Perhaps not stably, even advanced meditators sometimes, they can have dips in their practice quality, and they have to exercise more effort again. But there's a balance to that, and balance between effort and effortlessness as one goes through practice. It depends on one's circumstances, so it's a changing thing, and it's something one has to kind of feel out themselves and then learn. One of the key dynamics in meditation, one could say, the balance between effort and effortlessness. But generally speaking, as one kind of gets more advanced, less effort needs to be applied, and it becomes much more, again, a passive endeavor. And there, indistractability is a good kind of translation. The mind has the quality, not an action or activity of concentrating, but rather the quality of being indistractable. So there's a lack of interference, and a flow or an orientation towards an object, towards focusing on an object. That activity is begun, it started, and then one simply does not interfere. Simply does nothing. And then, with that lack of interference, the set agenda, the set intention to follow the breath, for example, carries on undisturbed. And the word indistractability also has this kind of it's linked to kind of the fact that concentration is basically tantamount to distance from the hindrances. So in classical Buddhism we have these 5 hindrances, the pancha nivaranani, the 5 curtains, or the 5 kind of the 5 coverings, literally. There's overt or too much desire. There's wanting too much, wanting something that is not present to be present, and wanting that in a clinging, craving way, not simply by setting an intention, okay, let's feel out the breath, or in something like metta practice, let's go for metta. That kind of desire, that kind of aim is completely wholesome. But this, when it becomes a hindrance if there's clinging to it, and if there's kind of if there's a pressure to it, and if it's kind of constant in some sense. There's a sense of frustration with how things are, and then like a strong desire for things to be otherwise, for a particular kind of experience. That's the first hindrance. Too much desire, or desire coupled with frustration or some other form of aversion. And here we can say one of the ways we can perceive the difference between craving, which is unwholesome, and craving and clinging, which are unwholesome. And desire is that craving and clinging always include some element of aversion. So there's something that is not liked in the present, like the fact that something is missing, for example, is not liked. Something present is hated, or something future is feared. One could fear, for example, the non-acquisition of that object. I want this experience, or I want this thing. Maybe I won't get it, and I don't like the fact that I might not get it, or I don't like the fact that it's not present. So some element of aversion there. So craving and clinging they're always a kind of like a coupling of desire and aversion, whereas desire itself is completely wholesome. It's non-clinging. It's just just motivation, and there's actually a word for this even in Theravada Buddhism, in the classical Southeast Asian old school Buddhism. Which is the most austere in its orientation, the most kind of world rejecting in some sense. There's a word for this kind of wholesome desire, which is chanda, sometimes translated as motivation. So one, of course, needs to be motivated. One needs to kind of motivate the mind. One needs to have motivation. One needs to have a kind of desire to do anything, to engage with anything, even with concentration practice. But too much desire is like clinging. Desire coupled with aversion is a hindrance. The second hindrance is aversion itself, vyapada. This sense desire or too much desire is called kamachanda in Pali. The second one is vyapada, aversion. So just hating something that is present, not liking it, fearing for something to be present in the future that one doesn't like. Hatred and fear in all of their kind of different grades. Also a hindrance, and again the hindrance that actually underlies the first hindrance in some sense, or is always coupled with the desire to create clinging and craving. Not helpful. It's not. One can notice that something could be different, or one can notice that okay, the mind is not actually very concentrated right now, and then one can do something different to kind of to engage with the object more deeply, for example, with the breath, find more pleasure in it, find more fascination in it, look more deeply into it or whatever. So one can, notice that something could be better, and then become motivated to do something different, and that's fine. But too much of if one becomes, if there's if there's that kind of clinging that one keeps on not liking things as they are, it tends to kind of ramp up into frustration and so on. And this is, aversion is the thing that the too much effort often brings about. One is averse to one's practice. It feels unpleasant. One doesn't like the practice itself. There's no relaxation. There's no kind of there's none of that kind of settling into a warm bath kind of thing. That good kind of that optimally meditation practice would include. There's no pleasure involved. It's not happy. It's frustrating. It feels like a chore, and so on. And one has the feeling it's not going well. So that feeling that this is not going well is one of the key like the core kind of elements in this kind of aversion. The third hindrance is udhacha kukucha. So restlessness and worry. So one is kind of restless. There's too much energy in the mind. Sometimes it's said too much energy. It's restless. It's kind of like it's what is often called a monkey mind. It jumps from one thing to the other. It's engaged in too many objects at the same time. It cannot settle with one thing. And this often arises out of worry. So one has, for example, work stress, or is worried about something like a health issue or whatever, or worried about the quality of one's practice, again tying into aversion, and so on. The hindrances tie into each other, very much. They form the foundations or bases for each other in a sense. They form like a kind of tangle. Restlessness is often based in worry, not helpful, and then often one can counter this by effort can actually help counter this restlessness and worry, focusing more deeply on the object and so on. Or sometimes relaxation also can help. Again, it's always about the balance and about the current circumstances. Fourth hindrance is tina midha, so laziness and lethargy. It's often said laziness being basically procrastination, or not being motivated to begin something. This can take place before the session. One isn't motivated to sit, or it can take place during the session. One isn't motivated to kind of to apply, for example, skillful or wholesome effort. One is not kind of motivated to apply one's mind. So there's a lack of diligence in that sense. There's no kind of none of that wholesome kind of striving, no motivation, no kind of no energy. So tina midha is, if restlessness and worry is too much energy, tina midha, laziness and lethargy, is too little energy. And the lethargy aspect is drowsiness, like dullness and drowsiness. So the mind, lacks energy, starts drifting towards sleep, towards kind of, muddy waters, lack of clarity and so on. And this is a hindrance. It leads to distractions. It causes a collapsing of awareness. The mind no longer is vigilant enough to kind of to notice distractions arising. So basically they sneak up on you, and then you spend some time daydreaming about them, or mind wandering and so on. So it directly is related to a lack of awareness and or cause a lack of awareness, and this is certainly not beneficial. And the fifth hindrance is doubt. And doubt obviously ties into aversion and so on. When one has the feeling that things are not going somehow quite well, there's aversion to some aspect of the practice. It feels frustrating again, or boring, or dull, or unconcentrated, or whatever, and one is averse. It often, tends to result in some form of doubt. So one is kind of doubtful. Am I doing the right thing here? Can I even meditate? Am I a poor meditator? Is this whole path or activity for me? Can I do this? Yeah. Can I do, self-doubt? Can I do this? Or am I doing this in the right way? Is there even a point to this? Does this path have any value? That too, like any form of doubt in that sense. And these hindrances can be worked with in different ways, and many of them involve some level of involve the balance of effort and effortlessness, and applying oneself in a skillful way, orienting towards either more effort, for example, or more clarity, deeper engagement with the object, or more relaxation, kind of sitting back and kind of accepting things as they are, and not clinging on to particular goals or standards and so on. Always depending on the circumstance, and it's very difficult to give kind of very clear-cut rules on what to do in what situation, because it's so very complicated. But yeah, again, indistractability or samadhi in that sense is basically tantamount to the absence of these. So when these are overcome, that kind of they no longer interfere with the process of being contented with a simple object of, let's say again, the breath. And that then leads to more effortless ways of being with the object, and leads to the bliss of samatha and the well-being and tranquility and so on. And of course here again we can see this whole thing is a very complex interplay of different things. Engagement with the object and applying effort, for example, in one's practice can itself lead to a distancing from the hindrances. One is more occupied with the object, an attitude of okay, now let's do this, and then applying oneself to the object. That can lead to a distance from the hindrances. Kind of samadhi is emerging, samatha is emerging, and then that distance from the hindrances makes the practice easier to do in the rest of the session, and that can then kind of promote further distance from the hindrances. Satisfaction arises, satisfaction with the practice, lack of aversion starts dissipating and so on. Doubt starts dissipating. One is satisfied and contented with how it's going, so there's no unwholesome desire or craving in that sense. A balance between too little and too much energy is achieved. There's a centering of the forces of the mind towards the object. So even more distance from the hindrances. So in this sense we can see it's a feedback loop. One kind of begins the practice, and for example applies some effort to kind of to lead to some degree of samadhi and samatha, and that samadhi and samatha, that distance from the hindrances, then kind of makes it easier for the mind to kind of sustain the samadhi and deepen it and so on. And it's like a spiral, kind of going deeper and deeper. Of course, in a particular session, and this is very important, also to kind of counter any aversion and doubt and so on, it's very rarely all that linear. So a very common trajectory for a practice session of especially like a samadhi session is that there's concentration. It deepens in the beginning of the session, but then can collapse as one is again kind of thrown out of the loop, And then, aversion and so on, and doubt can emerge, and one just has to try again. Try again, and then go down again into deeper samadhi, and then it can become perhaps deeper than the first time. It can be like a seesawing thing, going deeper and deeper. But back to the bliss and benefits of samadhi, which is the kind of what I mostly want to talk about. This also involved a lot of stuff about samadhi in general, but the bliss and benefits again. A sharper mind is just very useful for anything, any activity whatsoever. We're always with the mind, whatever we do, the mind is always present. Even in sleep, the mind is always present, and the mind's dynamics are always present, and the mind's tendencies are always present. And sharpening the mind, collecting it, gathering it together, achieving some level of what's called unification of mind. Chitta ekaggata. The mind becoming as if one point, one pointedness. It's very useful for anything. The mind becomes also more flexible. You can the mind kind of controls itself. So it's not the self controlling the mind. Again, and this is something that maybe in future videos or other resources, you can and in your own contemplation, you can think about no self and so on, which is a very core insight, of course, in especially Buddhist philosophy, but not only in Buddhist philosophy mind. It's also in other traditions, most traditions to some degree. It's not the self controlling the mind; it's the mind taming itself. So the mind becomes it's more of a kind of it's a democracy in some sense. That tends to manifest a kind of sense of tyranny or a sense of central control, but it's actually in some sense a democracy, and that democracy becomes more unified. So there's less parties, involved, and they squabble less. So it becomes more kind of collected, and this collective endeavor then is kind of it's more flexible. The mind can kind of steer itself to whatever thing it wants to do, including insight practice. So that's one of the great benefits of samadhi, and certainly never to be understated. And the bliss of it, the other benefit is the bliss of it, just samatha. For ultimately in meditation practice, we are not concentration by itself is certainly not the be all end all of practice. We're not just aiming to have a concentrated mind and so on. We're aiming to achieve some semblance of well-being and to cultivate, sustainable well-being that will be, a win-win for all, not based on material objects, not based on material success and so on, but based on a happy, settled mind, a tamed mind. The Buddha very much, emphasized, the taming of the mind in the suttas. And samatha in that sense is the goal. We aim for that well-being and tranquility. We aim to be contented with what we have. And samadhi practice certainly brings about, if it deepens to any degree, and especially if one is attuned, that's very helpful for the cultivation of samatha, is to be very attuned to even a relative sense of stillness or settledness. Again, not cultivating aversion or aversive tendencies, not over-efforting all the time, not kind of, striving with that mindset that, like the mind is not well, it's not functioning well, it has to be better, but rather kind of, noticing even a relative sense of stillness and quiet and contentment, noticing the bliss of samadhi, and that tends to reinforce it. And when it's reinforced, one becomes more familiar with it, and one kind of achieves more confidence in it that it is attainable, and one's mind becomes more attuned to cultivating it further. So it becomes something that the mind wants to do and wants to enter into. That well-being, that samatha, is at the very center of what we're aiming for. Well-being in the here and now, mindful presence, happiness, the subtle bliss of being here and now, free of worry, free of laziness and lethargy, free of aversion, free of craving, free of doubt. So, and that is great. Anyone who has tasted it to any kind of deep extent knows how very satisfying it can be. And the deeper it gets, the more satisfying it of course is. But even again, a relative stillness, a relative settledness is already like very blissful if one just notices it. And again, it's something I would exhort anyone engaged in meditative practice or interested in meditation to practice samadhi and to kind of and attempt to practice it skillfully, balancing that effort and effortlessness, having a relaxed mindset that does not cling so much to particular results, the particular results of a particular session, but instead sees the whole practice as a kind of like a lengthier process that has its ups and downs, but applies itself skillfully and does not forgo the potential and this possibility of cultivating the mind so it becomes more happy in a way that does not rest on material things, again, on things that are quite so fleeting. Samadhi and access to samadhi is also fleeting and insecure. Everything is impermanent and insecure, unfortunately. But and even samadhi, access to samadhi and skill in samadhi and so on can dip very greatly and suddenly, even for very advanced meditators. But it's more secure of a foundation, certainly, than material things. And it does not burden our society or our world or nature and so on to any extent. And it also it usually leads to a kind of more free-flowing empathy towards others as well. A still mind is and a kind of a happy mind is often quite naturally and inherently compassionate and loving and benevolent. And of course, one can utilize the sharpened mind not just for insight practice and so on, but also in the cultivation of positive energy states, in the cultivation of heart practice, of metta and other brahmaviharas, the divine abodes, or any kind of positive emotion practice. One can apply the sharpened mind to generate and cultivate and stabilize happy, loving states of mind in a wider sense as well. So, practice well, be happy. May you be ever so happy. May you never be separated from your happiness. May your days be filled with with sunshine, both literal and metaphorical. If you like literal sunshine, if you don't, then by all means no. But may your life be full of pleasure, full of happiness, full of love. Love is perhaps the greatest pleasure in life. Also because it's so pure like a mountain stream. And similarly pure is the bliss of samadhi. Thank you for listening or watching, and I hope to provide more videos of the shorter nature in the future. Bless you, my friend.